when you really look at the approach to try to save journalism, to try to transform journalism over the past 10, 15 years, so much of that has been focused on, well, let's just create some resources and then we'll give it to the newsrooms. And the problem is the newsrooms can't take what we're giving them. They just don't have the capacity, the bandwidth to take full advantage of everything that's out there. And so there's a gap between the resources, which are really wonderful. There's a gap between those resources and what the newsrooms can do. So COLab is really shifting, as you know, this year toward how can we help bridge that gap? How can we get more feet on the ground with newsrooms, holding more hands? How can we actually help them try some of the things that may make a difference in this situation that they're in? You know, there are news professionals out there, news leaders who are sleeping in their offices and delivering their own newspapers and trying their best to try to keep their heads above water. And we're in a very critical situation right now. The economy has been a struggle, especially through COVID. We don't know how it's going to evolve with a new administration in the next 4 years. We have seen from this last election that connection with local media may be our last best chance to have shared sets of facts. And so if we don't figure out how to support local news media in a way that feeds and nourishes local communities, then all of this other work that we've been doing over the past decade or so is really for naught. It's not going to work.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Regan Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. This episode, I talk with Laura Frank, head of the Colorado News Collaborative, better known as COLab, a journalism service organization that's been central to making Colorado a hotbed of collaboration and innovation in local news. I've had the privilege of working closely with Laura as a COLab board member and ecosystem partner, and I've seen firsthand how the organization is tackling some of the toughest challenges facing local newsrooms today, from financial sustainability to fighting burnout. Laura is a longtime investigative journalist and media innovator. Before founding COLab, she helped launch iNews in response to the closure of the Rocky Mountain News, and later worked at Rocky Mountain PBS, where she helped pioneer collaborative reporting projects. Laura is a founding member and chair emerita of the Institute for Nonprofit News, and under Laura's leadership, COLab works with over 180 Colorado newsrooms to foster collaboration and deliver impact that no single newsroom could achieve alone. In this conversation, we explore what it takes to sustain local journalism, the importance of building trust and engagement with communities, and the transformative role philanthropy and partnerships can play. This is a long conversation covering a wide swath of the issues and challenges that Laura and I deal with daily. I have worked hard to avoid making this podcast merely a promotional tool for Colorado, but there is great work going on here with lessons for the entire country and common challenges the industry must confront as we evolve. I hope this episode provides tips and food for thought for those working in this space. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and tell your friends about us. This is a side project and a labor of love, and your support means a lot. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com, or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. And now I bring you Laura Frank. All right, welcome to the podcast, Laura. Great to have you.
Thanks, Tim.
So this is maybe an overdue recording. In full transparency, you and I know each other very well, work very closely together. You are head of the Colorado News Collaborative, better known as COLab, and I am on the board of COLab. And in fact, the Press Association was one of the early funders, and we talk regularly or constantly and have joint team meetings now once a week. So this will I don't think there's a real conflict here, but I'm definitely vested in what you're doing. And we'll also have maybe, hopefully not, but maybe the curse of knowledge here. Well, if either of us notice something that you and I know, but maybe the audience doesn't, we can stop the other and go back and explain.
Okay, sounds good, Tim.
All right. So why don't we start with just what COLab is and why it was founded?
Yeah, well, COLab is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are really a journalism service organization, and it was founded right at the start of the COVID pandemic, because that's always a really good time to start something new when there's a global pandemic. But the need turned out to be something different than we originally thought. I, at the time, was at Rocky Mountain PBS, and we were building a new building, and the third floor of the building was available to be leased. And some folks like the Associated Press said, wow, we'd like to be in that facility. So the idea originally was to create a kind of shared news space, physical space. Well, everyone knows what happened with COVID, and that was not how we started. In fact, we jumped ahead. We kind of flipped things on their head and jumped ahead to really working virtually with news organizations outside of, not only in the Denver metro area, but outside of that, all across the state. And I think that in some ways, COVID was a bit of a silver lining for the work that we were doing, because people became so used to connecting remotely and really were hungry for some kind of connection with peers. And so COLab was born. We were originally staffed to look at how to help with collaborative reporting, but it became pretty quickly clear that needed to expand beyond just collaborative reporting. And so we shorthand what we do by calling it reporting, reach, revenue, and resources. So we do help with collaborative reporting, and I'm sure we'll get into some of what that looks like, but we also help with public engagement and with changing revenue models and with connecting people with resources. So COLab works with more than 180 news organizations all across Colorado to help them do the 4 Rs.
I think I can say this as someone who was attracted to move to Colorado in part because of the work COLab was doing, as well as Colorado Media Project and the Press Association. It is a key part of why Colorado has, I think, legitimately become known as one of the hotbeds of collaboration and innovation in journalism. I think there's only a handful of other states or cities that I would kind of put in that same category of where interesting work is being done. And COLab's, a huge part of that. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the evolution in more depth as we go along. But let's talk a little bit about the ecosystem here. What paved the way for you, do you think, for COLab to be successful and for the ecosystem to be known as innovative and collaborative?
Yeah, I think you're right, Tim. We get a lot of attention in Colorado for the ecosystem and how we all work together. And I like to say, it's not my phrase. You've heard it before. Goes something like, it was an overnight success, 10 years in the making. And that's definitely the situation here in Colorado. We have actually 15 years probably. We have had very serious nonprofit-led collaboration in Colorado for 15 years. And so there is a level of trust among news organizations here that just has built over time. And I started in that realm in 2009 when the Rocky Mountain News closed. And I helped start something called iNews, which was the Rocky Mountain Investigative News Network. It's a little bit like INN. The Institute for Nonprofit News started at the same time. And disclosure, I was on the board for many years at INN and still am active in that organization. And so we have seen that evolve, those relationships evolve over time. So when when folks look at Colorado and think, oh, we want to do that, you absolutely can do it. But also you will have to build those relationships and try to get to that level of trust with each other if you want to have the kind of successes that we've had here. And be prepared for evolution. What you think will need to happen will change.
As you're indicating there too, crises can be really fertile ground for evolution and forcing change. And that, I think you're exactly right. It started with the closure of the Rocky. We had the Denver Post rebellion, and then we had COVID. And I think all three of those things really set you up for the services you ended up providing. Let's fast forward all the way to the present. You coined a phrase that then Dick Toffel picked up on. News Revenue Hub used it recently: fried and frozen. That's how so many in newsrooms are feeling right now, and it's a huge problem for that evolution. So describe that phenomenon.
Well, this is something that fried and frozen. The newsrooms we work with here in Colorado, but it's happening all over the country too, are running up against this issue of being both fried and frozen. Fried because they're overwhelmed, understaffed, underfunded. Frozen because they're not quite sure what they should do to fix their situation. And they're a little bit afraid to pick things because what if what you pick actually weakens your fragile state instead of helping you? And even if they could get over that fear, there's just not enough time in the day to try to research what are the best things to try next in order to increase revenue and connection and all those 4 R's that we've been talking about. So this has really, when you look around at what we've done at INN, what we've done with other, with funding across the country, when you really look at the approach to try to save journalism, to try to transform journalism over the past 10, 15 years, so much of that has been focused on, well, let's just create some resources and then we'll give it to the newsrooms. And the problem is the newsrooms can't take what we're giving them. They just don't have the capacity, the bandwidth to take full advantage of everything that's out there. And so there's a gap between the resources, which are really wonderful, and all of those things that have been developed to help newsrooms. There's a gap between those resources and what the newsrooms can do. So it's a bit like drinking from a fire hose for them. And so COLab is really shifting, as you know, this year toward how can we help bridge that gap? How can we get more feet on the ground with newsrooms, holding more hands? How can we actually help them try some of the things that may make a difference in this fried and frozen situation that they're in? There are news professionals out there, news leaders who are sleeping in their offices and delivering their own newspapers and trying their best to try to keep their heads above water. And we're in a very critical situation right now. The economy has been a struggle, especially through COVID. We don't know how it's going to evolve with a new administration in the next 4 years. We have seen from this last election that connection with local media may be our last best chance to have shared sets of facts. And so if we don't figure out how to support local news media in a way that feeds and nourishes local communities, then all of this other work that we've been doing over the past decade or so is really for naught. It's not going to work.
And that's where I think organizations like COLab are just so crucial to addressing that very problem. And that problem, I think, is the quintessential problem, right? I mean, we've got a fundamental economics of news problem that dates back 20 years now, and it's only gotten worse. And they don't have the resources to do that evolution many times. And now they're so short-staffed and even more out of resources than they were, 10, 15 years ago. And they don't have the mental bandwidth to do it, as you're saying. Press Forward is a great initiative, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I think Press Forward realizes this too. Just throwing money at the problem is not the answer, right? And that's why the grant they just announced was for infrastructure and for organizations like COLab to figure out how we can help them innovate and lift some of that burden. Several years ago, 2 years ago, maybe 3, you and I had lunch with someone from the Knight Foundation, and they were talking about shared services. And I was so glad to hear that, because that's something you and I think talked about when I started here, is that, one of the reasons some of the large chains have been able to acquire newsrooms is because it made economic sense. There were services they could provide. And so how could we do that as an ecosystem? What services do you see as most needed, and how can infrastructure organizations step in to provide some of those?
Well, thanks for that question. All the services are needed, right? We know. So, but if we have to start prioritizing, the way to prioritize is what shared services are going to move the needle on either cost savings or revenue generation. Those are the two areas that will make the difference. So if we can think about how do we bring in tools and technology that might save time on the things that you have to do every day in a newsroom, how can we lighten that load? And then bringing in people, where are the needs? And part of the challenge is that the needs are different place to place. But we do know from our work that there are commonalities. And if we can kind of play matchmaker on who needs what right now. So for example, we know right now that there are multiple COLab partners who would like to have some data visualization and graphics work. That isn't necessarily what I just described as, saving time and money or making time and money, but that's something that they really want to have. So we are looking at how could we help facilitate that sort of thing. But what we'd really like to see is shared ad sales, shared underwriting, shared, maybe there's a chief operations officer role to play. So many of these news organizations have been mom and pop businesses, small businesses in rural towns. 40% of COLab partners are rural news organizations. 38, almost the same amount, 38% serve communities of color. So we know that there's a great need, and we can help them come together to work on that. So looking at ad sales management, looking at how to connect with community, like user-generated content and milestone announcements. We're looking at all of those kinds of things. How can we streamline that so that you have the kind of content that's really going to pull in people, and then you can capitalize on that content? So this is why I love so much working with the Press Association and thinking about, the ad sales kinds of work that you all do. How can we really coordinate what's available here in a more streamlined way? And then how can we help get that implemented in newsrooms? So one of the things that we're looking at from COLab's standpoint is how can we, we've got great resources in Colorado with colleges and universities who have journalism and media studies programs, and business schools and entrepreneurial programs. How can we connect those resources to the front lines of newsrooms so that students can learn in an experiential setting, and newsrooms can benefit from from smart students thinking and fresh points of view? And how can we make those connections? We're also working with other organizations. Like we're in talks right now with SCORE, which used to stand for the Senior Corps of Retired Executives. So how can we bring in people who have expertise in strategic business development, in ad sales, in all of the kinds of things that may not be the strengths of those owners of these small businesses, in most cases, small businesses, how can we connect the resources we have, but put feet on the ground to help implement them? How do we need to be the bridge.
Absolutely. And I just want to underscore, your mention of rural. If folks haven't listened to the Reviving Rural News podcast or read that book, they reported that well over half of the news rooms in this country are in community news rooms, that mostly weeklies, mostly rural, some suburban as well. And not only are they the most numerous types of organizations, they also have the majority of news consumption happens in those institutions, and they often get left out of the conversation. And they are the most stretched thin and the least able to evolve without this kind of help.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what we're seeing. And I also commend Reviving Rural News to anyone, whether you think you care about rural news or not. It is, and that was a great podcast, Tim. It's an issue that is relevant whether you're in a rural area or not, because a lot of the lessons that we're learning from the work we're doing with rural news organizations are actually going to apply with some of the hyper-local non-rural, some of the urban and suburban news organizations are either now or will be soon facing the same kinds of challenges that the rural news organizations are facing.
Yeah. And I've thought a lot about that conversation in that book in light of the election. One of the things that was mentioned in the book in terms of the experiment that was done with Joey and Lindsay in Newton, Kansas, but that Pat Ferrucci really pressed on the podcast is this isn't just about better journalism, while that's important. It's also about these news organizations as community institutions. And it doesn't always have to be around the conversations and the things we facilitate. It doesn't always have to be about the journalism, right? In Kansas, they had their press club and did gatherings. First one was at the newsrooms, and they would start doing it in businesses that were new in town. And hey, come see the new, whatever office or business. It wasn't about the news. It wasn't a brews and it. What's the alliteration?
News and brews, yeah.
News and brews. Thank you. Kind of which are great. I love those, and we should do those. But it doesn't always have to be about that. It can be just about, hey, we have the megaphone in the community. Let's just get people together and make sure people know each other. And I think that's such an important role for these newsrooms. And I think what we've seen in the election, and really seen for the past decade, if not 20 years, 30 years, this polarization is part because we don't interact, right? And so I just wanted to underscore that point. And I know COLab has done a lot around community engagement, as well as DEI work. There was some great works with the Voices Project, as well as Voter Voices, which is a whole other thing. But if you want to elaborate on any of that.
Yeah, thank you. So the Voices Project was something that started with Free Press and the Colorado Media Project, and something that COLab stepped into and then expanded. It was a series of working groups with people from around the state, and we were really trying to talk with communities of color. So we had Black voices, Indigenous voices, Latino voices, and Asian voices. Now, all four working groups were asked the same question: how can your local media better serve you? And the answers were fascinating. All four groups, one of the top things in all four groups that they said was, look, our stories aren't being told, or they're being mistold because we don't have connection with news organizations and they don't have connection with us. And the root problem is we don't know each other. We don't even know how to get to know each other. We don't know how to connect with each other. So COLab, with funding from the Media Project through a grant program that they had, was able to create something called Amplify Colorado. And it is really a digital tool that brings together people with different experiences and expertise in communities and the newsrooms serving those communities. It's basically an online open database with people's biographies and contact information, what languages they speak, what areas of experience or expertise they have. And so communities can find journalists who may be the people who can help get their story into a larger media outlet in their community. And then people in newsrooms can find folks who have expertise when they're reporting about whatever the subject is. So you can search by subject, you can search by geography. If you go to COLab.co, you can find Amplify Colorado on there. And I think right now, there are probably more than 150 people who have uploaded their information, their bios and their contact information. And we really want to take that and use it as a tool, help our partner newsrooms use it as a tool that they can then connect even further with their local communities. So it's been a great project, but there's, I think, way more still to come on that, where we could really help newsrooms and communities use that as a tool very specific to their communities.
And COLab has also just launched the Pressing Issues Gathering. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that's about?
Yeah, pressing matters. So,
Pressing matters.
Yes, there's lots of pressing around these days, isn't there? Pressing Matters is a series that we're co-hosting with the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So collaboration is in our name. We love collaborating with places that share factual information and have the idea of promoting communication, quality, civil communication. So Pressing Matters is looking at the intersection of some of the big issues of our time and the role that a free press plays in helping to understand those issues. The first one we had, of course, we had to look at the issue of misinformation, disinformation, and the election, and how the individual person can deal with this. How do you actually look at information you're getting and know whether it's reliable? And of course, the easiest answer to that is know your source, understand the source of the information, and connect with your local source of information, your local news organization. You can go to colabnews.co, and up in the right hand of that website, the right hand button says find your local news, and you can find sources of news that you can trust, because we know they live in the community, they cover the community, they adhere to journalistic ethics, and they care about what they're sharing. They're not out there just trying to generate revenue and clicks. I'm going to start teaching some classes, as you know, Tim, in January at the University of Denver. So I've been doing a lot of reading on the theories that are relevant to what's happening in the journalism ecosphere right now. And one of the theories is the theory of the public sphere. And we've always had in this country public spheres, but they've been driven by different things. Early on, it was really, what we might now call the elites who had access to information, who could pay for the sixpenny press instead of the penny press. And so that left a lot of people out. Well, then the penny press came and that evolved. But then the commercialization of news and information came, and we have something, the public sphere is now being driven by commercial interests. Whether they're personal, you have a blog and you want to, become rich, you want to become an influencer on TikTok or whatever it is, the forces driving that are different than they were to begin with. So I think one of the challenges for us is, how do we as a society pull the public sphere back to the place where it's actually benefiting the public, not benefiting commercial or personal interests? And that's a big challenge. And it's going to take everybody working on it, not just COLab, not just the Press Association, everybody working together. And not just these journalism organizations or funders. It's going to take the public. It's going to take people who care about whether we have shared information, shared facts in our communities. One thing that really has me thinking, and you and I have talked a little bit about this before, the Reuters study that said half of young people actively avoid news. Not just, I'm not interested in it, or I'm not paying attention right now because I'm young and I'm not worried about what taxes I pay or something. That's always been true. But right now, 50% of young people actively avoid the news. And if we can't figure out how to connect with those people, then everything else we're doing will be for naught. We have to understand, how do we get past this idea of actively avoiding the news? So one of the things that we're interested in is looking at some of the ways that we can reach people in a more approachable way. So we're working with news games to create, people are familiar with the New York Times Wordle. We're creating news games, word games, that will be automated, so it's not going to run into that fried and frozen problem. They'll be automated with AI. You can edit them, but you can send out every day a word game that will pull people into your content. It leads back to the reporting that you've done in your local community. And we know that communities care about, what you might call milestone announcements, births, deaths, marriages, those kinds of things. How do we, and what's happened in that realm is that's been taken over by companies that are making high profit and making, if you've had the misfortune of having to purchase an obituary lately, they're ridiculously expensive and hard for a lot of families to afford. And therefore, people aren't doing it. But when they do, the companies that news organizations are using to help manage those leave them only pennies on the dollar. So the news organizations are losing out on that. So if we can bring back some of that kind of news and make it easier and simpler for news organizations to provide that to their communities and not leave money on the table when doing it, then that's a win-win. It's good for the community, it's good for the news organization, and it helps foster the bonds of a community. And that's really, this is what you were talking about earlier, the kind of things, the kinds of actions, the kinds of events that a news organization in a community might sponsor or promote. Those can be things that help draw a community together rather than split it apart. And that's what we're hoping to help foster.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important because, the avoidance issue, there's a generational definite peak there, but I think it's going to be a problem, the pretty widespread problem, particularly coming into a new Trump administration, which regardless of your politics, we know, I think everyone would agree, the first term was very tumultuous and a lot of people got burned out then. And I think there's already anticipatory burnout right now. And so I think we've got to figure out how to engage people, and it's not going to be by playing into that. And it's not always going to, the hard news is super important, and I'll come back to that. But, one of the reasons we're in this economic situation, as well as the audience problem, is because the internet has disrupted the bundle, right? So you would come to a local newspaper or listen to a local newscast for sports scores or horoscopes, even comics, stock prices, all kinds of things that now you just get on the internet. And so people who are coming for that other thing would see the news and they would be aware. And I think we're seeing a lot of decreased awareness of what's going on in communities. So I don't know how much we can rebuild that bundle, but we could certainly do games. We've seen what that's done for the New York Times, but there is a local version which you're experimenting with. But it's also arts coverage, it's business coverage, it's just helping connect people to the community. And I think we've really got to double down on that to tackle that avoidance problem.
Yes. The fractionalization of information is a huge challenge. But again, I think we can rebundle some of these things. And if we do it smartly, then we're going to have an impact. We've lost a whole generation, maybe more. We've lost a whole generation at least who don't have the habit of going to a news source. They're used to information finding them. And so one of our challenges is, how do we think about that? Do we need to take the news that is essential in a community and figure out more creative ways for it to find the people it needs to find? Do we need to figure out ways to make it more attractive, to give incentives for people to search out the news and information in a centralized place? The answer to that question is not clear yet. And so we've got to do these experiments to see, maybe some A/B testing on what is going to be most effective. And having been in this realm for a decade and a half of trying to reinvent news, I suspect the answer is going to be both. I can remember you were talking about meeting with foundations earlier. I can remember being in a meeting about 15 years ago with a number of large foundation representatives. I won't name the foundations, but I can remember having a conversation. This was right after the Rocky Mountain News closed and a number of other newspapers closed, and the scope of the crises was coming in to clearer view. And we said, if we can just have philanthropy give us a runway of 2 or 3 years, then we will find the new business model and everything will be okay. Now we can laugh about it. It's hilarious now to think that we thought that, but there were a lot of smart people in that room, and that was the consensus. Yeah, if we can just have philanthropy give us about a 3-year runway, we'll figure out the next business model. And of course, what happened was there was no the next business model. There are many, many business models, and it depends on all kinds of circumstances what's going to be successful or not. And you need multiple revenue streams, not one replacement. So I think the answer to that question of how do you reach people? How do you pull them in, or do you send it out? It's going to probably be both.
And, I think it's such an important thing to realize too. This should not be all on your newsroom and your reporters. Like there's the kinds of services we're talking about, but also there's community partners. One of the calendars are such I think an important part of local news. And people aren't getting it as much from Facebook as I used to think, because we're just overwhelmed with all of that. And you might not have the capacity in Macon, Georgia. I wanted to bring that back. And so we partner with the Local Arts Alliance, nonprofit. And we just said, hey, you've got a community calendar that anybody can submit to. Can you curate that? And we will publish it. Look to those kinds of partners. Let your reporters do the reporting. Use your other resources and your partnerships to meet some of those broader needs.
I think that's a great point, and something that we've seen an evolution in that thinking. You and I are both old enough to remember when newsrooms would never partner with anyone, let alone another, even perhaps another newsroom, let alone a non-news organization. And that's beginning to change. I think we both agree that there have to be, some cautionary rules set out there. You need to think about, are you partnering with someone who has the same kinds of values that a news organization does? But there are lots of places out there. There are lots of other nonprofits and civic organizations and those kinds of things that can play a role. I'm thinking about, I already mentioned colleges and universities. I'm also thinking about public libraries and the civic organizations that are, nonpartisan and focused on how to strengthen a community. And then there are ways, I think we also need to expand our thinking about, what does partnership mean? It may not mean, kind of in the traditional sense, oh, I'm working alongside this other organization, but changing the way that we talk about media, You brought up Joey and Lindsay from Manhattan, Kansas. I think they are, I know you've had them on this podcast, and I would recommend people go listen to that again, or for the first time if they haven't already, thinking about how you might position yourself as a news organization as an asset in the community. Well, there are lots of other places, organizations, entities that want that kind of organization to exist in their community. I'm thinking about, well, what about the Chamber of Commerce? Could they support something? Could they underwrite some of that engagement? They're not buying stories in your newspaper. They are helping to support the engagement of the public around quality news and information. So you know, people have gotten very creative, and we're going to need to continue being creative to think about what really build relationship in a community.
Yeah. And just a quick fact check. They're on my list to reach out to. They have been to the convention, and we talked about them in the Reviving Rural News, but that's all right. But I want to amen all of that.
Because I think about them a lot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
me too.
I'm projecting there then.
Yes. You're predicting they are coming on, I'm sure.
Maybe.
I just gotta get a date with them. But I want to second and third all of that 100%. You know, even going back to the pressing matters, you know, you partnered with the museum, the Institute at the Denver Museum of Natural Sciences. Those kinds of partnerships are what we need. And it's not, there are many forms it takes, like you were saying. You need to get creative. And some of it, just like a reporter builds relationships, some of this is just relationship building. Like, even if the chamber is not going to partner with you on an event, do you understand their concerns? Community foundations, this came up on the podcast with Allison Taylor Levine. Most of them don't have big pots of money, you know, that they have discretionary dollar. They have some discretionary dollars, but most of it's directed by the donors, right? But they are still fantastic partners in terms of who should we be talking to the community? Who would be a good partner to throw an event? You know, what issues are animating this community that maybe we're missing out on? Those are the kinds of relationships that you should be building as a news organization for your journalism, if for nothing else, but could have huge dividend to reach and revenue as well. And tools like Amplify, even, it's a great way to pull people in.
Yes, it's a concrete way to give people an avenue to walk down to connect with your news organization. I mean, it's easy and it's effective. So what else can we do that is, you know, really, really effective? And what you were just saying, Tim, makes me think about something that's kind of a real reminder for everyone. So much of journalism has been over the years, a lot of it, you know, has been, well, we know the community and we're going to set the agenda and we're going to be in our ivory tower and tell people what they should care about. And we're setting, you know, that up by choosing what we cover. And that's broken. That is not the way to do journalism. Starting out in communication with your local community is the way to start out. What questions do they have? What do they want to know? And when you start there, then you have an audience, a ready audience waiting for the answer, paying attention. And if you let them know that we've heard you and we're asking your questions on your behalf, that completely changes the relationship that a newsroom has with its community. It becomes part of the community, not antagonistic toward the community. And I'm, you know, the first half of my career I spent as an investigative reporter. So it's not that I think news organizations should be part of the Chamber of Commerce. News organizations must serve a watchdog role, but news organizations also should not think that they are just so smart that they can do everything internally and then spew it out and expect there to be thanks at the end of that. We news organizations need to have that relationship with community to understand what it is people want to know and what they care about.
Yeah. And just like a good reporter would talk to people with differing opinions, engage the Chamber of Commerce, but engage, you know, some of the other people who often do battle with the chamber in terms of legislation, like bring multiple people to the table. Maybe you're not even facilitating a conversation, but you're understanding, the scope of the community's assets and disagreements. And some of this, I think, goes back to the fundamental: what is our purpose in our community? Larry Rickman at the Colorado Sun, I can't remember if he said this on my podcast or I've just heard him say it other times or we've talked about it, but the Colorado Sun has a mission statement or a tagline for a better Colorado. And he was saying that was controversial when they started, which I think is not surprising because I've dealt with it. I had something like that as a mission statement, one for my newsrooms in McClatchy. But news journalists sometimes push back on that. That sounds like an activist position, but wanting a better community is not. I mean, it kind of goes back to Jay Rosen's view from nowhere. No, there are some things I think we can all agree or agree on, and that we all want better communities, right? And so having that attitude and engaging organizations in the community who also want a better community, that we may differ on what that means, but engaging them and figuring out how can we foster conversation, how can we inform where people are misinformed, how can we just pull people together so they can figure it out, I think is not only legitimate for journalism, I think it's a moral imperative these days.
I couldn't agree with you more. And that you mentioned briefly earlier that COLab has an ongoing project called Voter Voices. And you just mentioned Jay Rosen. If listeners are familiar with the citizens agenda idea that Jay has been talking about for probably 30 years now, the idea is that news organizations talk to communities about what they want those want reporters to be covering, what questions they have, what issues they care about. And so COLab, building on that idea of citizens agenda, helped more than 60 newsrooms take that step toward listening. Because I was in the back of my mind as you and I were just talking about, newsrooms need to have this ongoing conversation. I was imagining our COLab and press association friends saying, yeah, and how am I going to get that done on top of everything else that I have to do? So this gets back to the whole fried and frozen aspect of journalism today. So what we did for Voter Voices in order to, facilitate that kind of public engagement, we partnered with Hearken through Colorado Public Radio. Hearken, of course, is is one of the tools you could use to ask questions of the public and allow them to easily send answers back to you. And Colorado Public Radio does a fantastic job of that. So we used that as a tool, a kind of shovel-ready tool to ask Coloradans, what do you want your local newsroom to ask politicians? What do you want the coverage to be? And more than 7,000 Coloradans told their local newsrooms what they thought were the most important issues and the questions they wanted politicians to answer for this recent election. That was amazing to us. And it was amazing to a lot of the newsrooms too. I'm thinking about one particular newsroom that's run by a single person who has a day job. And so it's an effort of love and lack of sleep, I suspect. But having participated in Voter Voices, she got feedback from, my goodness, almost 10% of her town responded to this when you look at the numbers. And she was able then to go to politicians with this sense of mission, and I'm here on behalf of the people, and these are the questions they want answered. And it was a completely different experience, both for her in that news organization and the community that, who felt very seen and heard. So it's, again, that's a win-win. And if what we want to do now is what COLab wants to do is take those lessons and figure out how we can seed that in other kinds of coverage. How can we help automate or at least make simpler that kind of feedback loop with the public? Because it makes a difference.
I want to go down a little rabbit hole because this is something that's very inchoate in my mind, and you and I briefly talked about this at one of our meetings, and that is local news and how it fits into the national picture. And I've been thinking a lot about this since the election, and not because in full transparency it wasn't the outcome I wanted, but because listening to some of the Vox Pop, the man on the street reporting, and some of the focus groups that some political actors were doing, and just hearing what people are saying, it's become really clear that reach is a problem, that people, and engagement, right? They're tuning out, they're avoiding. We're consuming different sets of facts, and I began to rethink, a trend that I was fully supportive of and may have written about, of local news really differentiating it from from national news and not engaging with it. We don't have the expertise. Even the big metros typically don't have DC bureaus anymore. What are we adding to the conversation? And I've begun to rethink that because, as we said earlier, over half of news consumption is in these small community papers. And I should begin rethinking what should our role in connecting local to national be. And I do not think it would be advisable to cover, the latest tweets that come out of a new administration or any of the outrage that's going to happen and push back. But how do we engage people on the ramifications and the local impact of what's going on nationally? And, there was a tweet I saw, or maybe it was a thread, and it was a picture, and I don't know if this was verified, but reportedly in Pennsylvania, there was a company that pulled some workers together and said, we're not going to be able to give out our year-end bonuses as usual because we've got to stock up in anticipation of tariffs. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the kind of, are we talking about the impact of tariffs and immigration policy and all the things that do animate our national politics at the local level? And that's really struggle. We're already fried and frozen, and now you want me to weigh in on something national. So, but maybe support organizations come in, or maybe we should be going back to carrying more AP content, or at least some headlines. Or have you started thinking along those lines?
Well, you had mentioned this to me, so I've been thinking about it since then. And if people hear you say that and think, well, that means I'm just going to take a national story about the immigration fight at the congressional level, or what's happening in Washington, and put it in my local paper, I think that's not the answer. But I am a proponent of, let's talk about how those national issues, those nationwide issues, impact us at the local level. That's actually what we wound up doing with voter voices. So when we ask people, what do you want? What questions should we ask politicians? Many of the issues were things they were hearing about for the presidential race, for congressional races. They talked about issues like immigration and the national economy and those kinds of things, which wasn't a surprise. But what we did with that then in the newsroom, what we helped the newsrooms do, was figure out how those things played on their local level. So the coverage that resulted from the voter voices community engagement were actually a series of stories that were titled something like, where does immigration appear on your ballot? Where does the economy appear on your ballot? And so we tried to take those big issues and really talk about the local impact of it. And again, I think what you're bringing up, Tim, is an example of a disconnect that has evolved over time. And so national politics has become a sport, and it's become disconnected from local politics and local governance. Not even not the politics, set that aside for a second, but local governance. What does it actually mean? And one of the things that I think has become more and more clear as there's been, analysis of the most recent election, many people were getting information not from those, you can call them legacy sources if you want, but not from those professional journalism sources. And that's a problem, because if our local news organization become trees in a forest and people are fractionalized in where they're getting their information, and they're getting it from people who don't adhere to journalism practices or ethics, it's what we're seeing, that polarization at the national level is going to invade everything at the local level. And then we've really lost our chance to stop that polarization. I think we have a limited window of opportunity to kind of stop the slide. And let me say, it's not the public's fault. It's news organizations' fault. We have been thinking, why aren't people flocking to us? We're giving them all of this wonderful, factual, real news, and people aren't flocking to us because we're not speaking in their language. We're not finding them the way that other news or other information sources are finding them. We're not giving them the information in ways that they can access. So if you are not someone who loves to read a narrative, 5,000 word, metro newspaper approach to something, then you're out in the cold for a lot of the really serious, in-depth journalism that happens in this country. And so we've really, I think, got to stop thinking of, if we build it, they will come, and start thinking more about how do we not become trees in a forest? How do we reach all people in our communities? And that's why we've got to bridge, we've got to solve the fried and frozen problem first, so that we can pry open some space in those newsrooms to become more innovative about how to reach our entire communities. It's a multiple step process, and it is not simple or clear cut, and it's not guaranteed to work, but it's really the only chance we have to stop the trend toward polarization.
Absolutely, 100% agree with all of that. And I think the Voter Voices was a good example of that type of reporting that I was alluding to. And I think, just to be clear, I don't think we do not want to reinsert ourselves. Jay Rosen said, don't use the national media as your model. And we don't want to just pull that content in, right? But sometimes we also avoid anything where we can be accused of being too liberal, which is more common. I've been at papers that got both too liberal and too conservative, but I think we've reacted and pulled into a safe zone, and I think we've got to rethink that. But also that complete picture is such a crucial part of it. One of the things E. Perlman said to me on the podcast earlier, a couple years ago, it's not necessarily a lack of information that is at the root of that polarization and that problem. It's how do we talk to each other? How do we engage each other, right? And so that's why I think some of those community engagement initiatives are so important. And we're not asking everyone to be a community engagement specialist, but can you facilitate? Can you open a door? Can you just be available as a journalist? Go to, do the open hours at the library. Do you have a question? Can we pull people together so that we can have some of those deeper conversations and talk past misunderstandings? Because it's not always just the lack of information. Sometimes it's lack of context.
I agree with you. And finding, there are some really interesting experiments going on right now. I'm thinking about Rocky Mountain Public Media and their Above the Noise, which I know you were involved in, where they took a documentary to communities all over the state and showed this documentary about, we're actually not as polarized as we think we are, and then had conversation around that. Colorado State University was involved in that, and they have a great center there for public deliberation, and thinking about how do we build that muscle and make that a part of what you expect when you live in a community, that we do have these conversations. I was talking earlier about the theory of the public sphere. It used to be that people would get together and talk about these things. And we're losing that. We've lost that. It's transferred into, different forms in social media, but they're very different. The conversation that happens is very different. There's that element of anonymity that allows people to just be rotten to each other. And again, the local community is where we have a chance to stop that, because I think it's clear we can't stop it on those platforms. We can't stop it at a national level. We've got to get back to, our neighbors are our neighbors, and how do we speak to each other?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Above the Noise, because I wanted to bring that up as well. And that's a great example, too, of the collaboration, not only between Rocky Mountain Public Media and, newsrooms that were part of CPA and COLab, but also with local organizations. And this probably didn't happen as much as we all would have liked in some of the communities, but like, in Denver, one of those events was at the museum and them as partners. And that was bringing different voices in. Ethnic Media was another partner. And so we have to do those sorts of things. I was just talking with someone about an event that a Spanish language publication put together, and they were really small events. And, who did you partner with, right? Like, there are groups that engage your community, and are you working with them to bring them out, and not just using, depending on your own megaphone?
I used to be at Rocky Mountain Public Media, and one of the things we talked a lot there about is what I called the COI, communities of interest, COI, COI. Tapping into communities of interest, not trying to recreate a wheel. We have no capacity to recreate any wheels in this industry. So if you can tap into existing networks of people who are interested in whatever topic it is that you're talking about, that you're reporting about and talking about, then that is the way to bring people in. So you're not having to recreate a wheel every time. And it was successful. We could even see a bump when we were successful at it. We could see a bump even in our Nielsen ratings. So it was working. People were engaging with journalism in a way that made a difference.
One quick thing I want to mention, then I want to talk about funding, and then we can go to rapid fire. You mentioned SCORE. And I love that you're working with them. SCORE is part of what's the organization? The
Small
Federal
Business Association.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Who also, if newsrooms haven't looked into loans, small business loans, that sort of thing, they're a great asset, and on many fronts. But particularly for maybe less for newsrooms than for organizations like COLab and the Press Association, are you tapping into some of the resources that are available in, state government, local government? Rebuild Local News is doing some great work, but it's not just about that. There are existing programs to help small businesses in particular. Their apprenticeship program, we got a loan, or I think maybe one of the first grants the Press Association has gotten was from the Colorado Workforce Development Council to hire an employee. And we're learning a lot more about the resources that the state has made available. There's a publisher who's blanking. She just went to work for a local media association. But during COVID, they partnered with their local government to get some advertising, not from the government, but to incentivize local advertising by doing a match. There are lots of resources. Governments want to see businesses in particular thrive. Most of our members, well, even if they're nonprofit, you're a business. And a lot of other businesses depend on you. And so I'm really glad to see, working with SCORE and with the apprenticeship program at the state, that sort of thing.
That's right. I get, you and I talk frequently, so I can't remember if we've talked about it in this conversation or before, but we're working with the state apprenticeship office. We know that right now, news organizations in Colorado are actually having trouble hiring people because they're not finding people who come in with the skills they need on day one to do the jobs they have now, let alone the jobs they're going to have 10 years from now, or even just 2 years from now. So what we're thinking is if COLab can serve as a central hub for these kinds of apprenticeship programs, then news organizations don't have to do the heavy lifting of creating them and becoming, recognized and approved and all of that paperwork and administration. If we can do that once and then help develop the programs that create apprentices for news organizations, then that could be a way to find people to diversify the workforce, because you may find people who weren't necessarily thinking that they wanted to work in journalism, but wow, this apprenticeship sounds really interesting, and I found out about it and let me dig deeper into it. And it also helps a news organization find an apprentice who then gets some support for learning how to do the job. And the idea is at the end of these 2,000 hours of apprenticeship, you actually hire the person who was the apprentice, and so it's good for job creation as well. Again, we're looking for win-win kinds of programs. Yeah, I should say, just fact check ourselves, that SCORE isn't part of the SBA. They get funding from the SBA. Their SCORE is a nonprofit, 501c3 itself, but they do get funding from the Small Business Administration.
Great. Yes. Thanks. The work you're going to be doing with University of Denver, I think is really crucial. We talk sometimes about the pipeline program in this industry, in particular as it regarding diversity. And I think it's underinvested in, not just at the college level, but the high school, scholastic associations and things like that. But I think it also needs people, organizations like COLab, and people like you now teaching at the university to really handhold, because you can't just throw interns at a newsroom. They are so fried and frozen. Having someone completely green does not solve the problem. So having some middle people who can do some of the heavy lifting and vet and train is really important.
I obviously couldn't agree with you more. And it's the University of Denver will have 3 classes that will be looking at, using tools that exist like Amplify, which we were just talking about, news games. How can we help have the students learn what this new challenge is to connect real news with community and actually be working with newsrooms? We're also looking at some of the, how to build or rebuild the public sphere. How can we use some of these tools? Like we were just talking earlier today about a tool where you can have user-generated content, that kind of holy grail that is such a challenge. How could we actually use some of the tools that we have now, AI, for example, to facilitate that process and make it actually content that is safe, reliable, trustworthy, and of interest to the public? How might we work through that? And then finally, just the general idea of using artificial intelligence for real news, to not to create news stories, not to create, but to take content that is created and maybe translate it into a different format, or to take some of the routine things that you have to do every day and make those things less burdensome for the newsroom. So those are the kinds of things we're looking at. And what we really want to do is expand that, because there are lots of great classes happening at colleges all over the state here. And if we can coordinate those in a way that could benefit not only the students, but also community newsrooms, then that's a great resource that we can leverage for each other. It's a win-win, right? You are thinking about how to better prepare students for the jobs of the future, the now and the future, and you're finding ways to help newsrooms evolve what they're doing. So it's really kind of the only choice we have.
And, I really don't think we can overstate the impact of that fried and frozen and how stretched thin people are and why these support organizations, infrastructure organizations are needed. We worked with a newsroom not too long ago who was having a financial crisis, had to walk them through what a P&L was and how to, to make one, right? One of my employees went to visit a newsroom, a small mountain town, ended up not being able to meet because the one reporter had to go help control traffic at an event. We're kind of pulled into that. These newsrooms are, collecting money and doing design and doing QuickBooks or not QuickBooks, whatever lesser tool they have, maybe pen and paper, and trying to do reporting and ad sales and everything. And so this infrastructure piece is just so critical.
Yes, I liken a local news organization to running a dairy farm. In a dairy farm, you can never take a vacation because the cows must be milked twice a day. You can't not milk the cows. It's the same thing with a local news organization. All those things have to be done. None of them cannot be done. And if there's only one or two or three people, everybody's doing everything. And so no wonder they're fried and frozen.
Let's end before rapid fire talking about funding. So we're entering what I think of as a new era, the press forward era. We know everyone at Press Forward would readily say this and probably actively say this. Philanthropy is not going to solve all our problems. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the revenue we've lost and we'll never get back. But it can be a crucial stopgap. It can be a crucial catalyst. But I think the success of it depends on so many things. I love that this next grant is infrastructure from Press Forward. I love that the first grant was sizable, $100,000, that it was general operating so that you did not have to take on more work to get it, and that it went to small newsrooms. In Colorado, it was overrepresented. I think 9 newsrooms got it, and I'm so happy for each of those 9. So they're all deserving. But my concern, too, is that we spend as an industry, philanthropy spends, $1 billion additional dollars, which is their goal, if not more. And we've just bought ourselves a little time, which is not nothing, but we don't transform. So how do you think about, just as an organization that is dependent on philanthropy, but is also someone who's just so invested in the ecosystem and the health of local news? That's why you're in this position. The best use of philanthropy? What concerns do you have about it not doing the job it needs to do?
I think philanthropy, like all the rest of us, have learned so much over, especially, obviously the last 15 years, but especially the last 4 or 5 years. And what we're seeing is actually Dick Toffel in the newsletter that you mentioned, where he was talking about the fried and frozen idea, where he was talking to me, he had something else that I think was even more important in that same newsletter. And that was, if funders don't realize it, sometimes giving small amounts of money for very specific, relatively small amounts of money for very specific things has an unintended effect of overburden. It makes the situation worse. If you're giving a little bit of money, but it takes a lot of money to do what they're actually trying to do, and then they're trying to do it for a little bit of money, or with rather a little bit of money, then you're not, it's not going to be successful. And that burns people out even more. It only adds to the fried and frozen. And I think a lot of philanthropists are beginning to realize that. And I get the instinct to want to, if you've got a pot of money, you want to spread it out to as many people, as many places as possible. But you might actually be doing damage. And I think you and I could probably think of multiple examples where we've seen that happen. And I hope that approach is changing, that other people have seen it too. And I get the sense that they have. And I think that's why Press Forward has been very clear about, all right, let's look at general operations. We, the funder, don't know best what you should do. You know best what you should do. And then the idea of supporting infrastructure. Well, how could, the infrastructure grants are even more sizable because it's going to take sizable to actually be successful. And if you have aggregated funding, then that aggregated funding really needs to be the source, because if you've aggregated funding over here and you're only giving a little bit of funding, where else are they going to go for the rest of the funding when you're already aggregating it in one place? So I think, we've learned these lessons. I think we're going to see them being implemented in the future. But the thing I still worry about, to answer your question, is the fried and frozen problem still exists. If you get $50,000 for your general operations, you're probably going to use that for the operations generally that you've been doing for however long you've been doing operations. So again, how do we try open space for innovation in newsrooms to try something different? And that's where I think the journalism service organizations really need to go. The organizations like COLab need to go down that path of helping pry open that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And Press Forward National, I think, has been very thoughtful, and I'm really pleased with a lot of what I'm seeing out of there. And we're getting a growing number of state press forwards, and Colorado Media Project, is the home of Press Forward here, and I think they've done tremendous work. But I think that this is an issue not just about Press Forward, but if they're successful, a lot of small cities, a lot of small funders, statewide funders, local funders, place-based funders, issue-based funders are going to be getting in the arena. And I think it's important to talk through, how do we wisely use that money? What are the power imbalances that come to play? And foundations, most of them are well aware of that, but we don't talk about it much. And this is an opportunity that we don't want to waste. And it's not unique to journalism funding by any stretch, and it's not even unique to philanthropy. I've been part of arts boards and, food kitchen type places, boards on those. And this is an issue, routinely, that we don't get enough general operating and we're taking on too much. The power imbalance is often an issue. But as you were indicating, not getting enough to really do something new and really invest is a huge issue. And when I was at Paste, running Paste magazine, I had the whole company, journalists, interns, layout, tech, read Good to Great by Jim Collins. And one of the things he talks about in there is investing enough to make something successful. Like, you go all in or get out, basically. And shortly after we read that chapter, there were some smartass posted signs around the building with that quote, kind of as a passive aggressive or just aggressive saying, "Are we doing too much around here?" Because we definitely played outsized roles. But at any rate, I think that's super important. That's why I was really glad to see these first couple national grants be sizable. But you can't just distribute your pool to affect the most people. You've got to really double down on something that's going to make a difference.
I agree. And I think that's one of the, Colorado Media Project was one of the first funder roundtables around journalism at a state level in the entire country. And so the things, again, Colorado on the cutting edge, the things that we've learned here, I think are, people are absorbing and benefiting from. So again, you're going to see, I think some different approaches and some really effective approaches to funding journalism, and that, that's something to celebrate.
And I think, as we enter this era, I think we need to have a lot more open conversations about how this progresses and how we engage each other. I alluded to the power imbalance. Just that whole relationship is fraught. My wife works in nonprofits, and she actually did her ILD, a leadership program at University of Denver. She did her project on that relationship between funder and fundee and where it's broken, and how funders in particular can help better facilitate things. There's a natural pushback. I mean, if you're not getting funding or you're not getting enough, newsrooms are always going to want more, right? And organizations like ours are almost also going to want more. But that's not a reason to kind of shut off the conversations, and involving the community place-based funders and all of that, having better open relationships, I think is crucial as we go down this road.
Well said, Tim.
All right, well, let's go to our rapid fire. So compared to a year ago, are you more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
Am I more or less? Maybe I'm not more or less, but I think that the challenges are clearer. It doesn't mean, just because they're clearer doesn't mean they're easier to solve, but we have a better chance of solving them because we understand them better. So I guess I come down on more optimistic.
Yeah, that's almost the universal answer. Although I must say, we had a group of visitors from Germany come into our office a couple of weeks ago. A few of them were reporters. Some of them worked for government. Basically, we had this discussion about more or less optimistic about journalism here, but also there. And I actually came away pretty depressed. The challenges are real. And I think I'm glad to hear most of my guests saying more optimistic. And I think it's a little bit of a self-selection bias because we're all doing interesting work. But we shouldn't undersell the challenges as well.
For sure. For sure.
Does AI fill you with more hope or dread when it comes to journalism?
Oh, AI definitely fills me with more hope. I think we will be able to become more efficient. And some of the challenges that it presents, we have variations of those challenges that would be there with or without AI, making sure that the quality of the content meets our expectations was already an issue. So I think on balance, we'll have to be, vigilant. We'll have to be careful. We'll have to have, kinds of internal rules for what we will and won't do with AI. But I think overall, there are ways to use it right now that will make us more efficient, and that will, like I say, pry open some of that space.
Yeah. And I haven't said a lot about this question myself, but I do want to weigh in here. The efficiency thing, there are so many ways it can be useful across the board. I'm very worried about the business model disruption. But at the same time, there is a possibility if we position ourselves and sort of maintain trust and grow trust and do some of the audience work we've talked about, that there might be a flight towards quality, right? If you don't know who to trust and don't know where the information is good or not, and we have institutions locally with people and follow good journalism practices, maybe we get some of that audience back just because people are so overwhelmed and don't know what to believe, and we're there to start filling in that gap. So I think that could be an optimistic version of how that plays out.
I love that. Yes. Flight toward quality. Yes.
Do you have a favorite piece of advice you've been given or that you like to give?
I do. And it's both. It's a piece of advice that my father gave me, and he gave this to everyone he ever knew who was getting married. And he said, the secret to a happy marriage is that you always try to treat your spouse better than they treat you. And I think that's a wonderful formula for a happy marriage. And it probably applies to many other scenarios other than marriage. We could use a dose of John Frank's advice in our political discussions, in all of our civic discussions, to make them more civil. Just try to treat people better than they treat you. If everybody were doing that, a lot of our problems would be solved.
Is there a piece of common advice or conventional wisdom that drives you crazy in its wrongness or oversimplification?
Yes. It's if we build it, they will come. We know now that that's not true. We can have the best content ever, and it doesn't mean that people will flock to us. So we've got to get over the idea that if we just keep improving the quality of the content, everything will be fine. It's good. Don't give up on making the quality of the content better and better, but we've got to do other things in order to make sure we're not trees in the forest.
Absolutely. And I think both parts of that equation are important, as you said. I think a lot of journalists, you and I know, fall into that trap. If we build it, they will come. A lot of business people, frankly, fall into the other trap of
Yes.
let's just grow, 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 and not worry about the product, and have underinvested in the product of journalism. Do you have a favorite failure of yours?
My favorite failure is always my most recent failure because the lessons are the freshest, I think. I was one of those people early on who thought, if we thinking better news was the answer. If we can just improve the quality of the news, people are going to figure it out. And I was dead wrong about that. So that's why my life's work now is beyond just the quality of the content and trying to figure out how to bridge some of those gaps.
Something we didn't really cover in the podcast that I probably should have. The quality of the work that the reporting team did in COLab, collaboratively, was super important. I think that's part of what helped establish the reputation. Starting with COVID diaries, and then reporting on mental health institutions and police abuse. And I just want to call out that there's been some really excellent reporting, not only from your staff, but in collaboration with newsrooms around the state.
Thank you for bringing that up. I agree. Those stories that you just mentioned were stories that would have been hard, if not impossible, probably mostly impossible for any one newsroom to do alone. So to do those collaboratively, and they had the impact that you want journalism to have. Laws were changed, policies were changed, people's minds were changed. But even then, it's not enough.
This business is hard. Nonprofits in general are hard. Most jobs are hard, let's be frank. But this can be particularly hard, and you and I have commiserated a lot over some of the challenges. What do you do to maintain your sanity or restore yourself?
Embarrassingly simple. I just go for a walk. I find that I do my best thinking when I'm walking. It calms me. We're really lucky here in Colorado to have amazing views when we walk, whether we're walking, here in the Denver metro area, looking up at the mountains, or up in the mountains, looking around. I also love camping. My husband and I have a little teardrop camper, and we go away to the mountains, and we do a lot of walking on those camping trips. So that's how I just reset. And I think I love that you asked this question because it's so important, especially right now. If you're in an industry where some portion of the populace thinks that you are an enemy of the people, we worry a lot at COLab, as I know you do too, about the mental health of and well-being of the people in this industry. So I hope that everybody has something that is rejuvenating and that easy to do, and that they do it a lot because it's important.
And some form of exercise and nature is almost a universal answer to this question. And we should have some walking meetings.
I love that. We do that a lot at COLab. We'll walk and talk. We'll walk and talk. But yeah, let's make ours walking and talking now.
Which leads me to the next question. As a leader, how do you think about making sure your team maintains their own mental health?
Same kind of thing. You talked about giving your team a book at one point. I've done the same thing. And the book that I gave them, let's see if I can remember the name of it. I think it was called Deep Thinking. And it was the idea that in a startup nonprofit like COLab, and in a lot of other organizations too, you're constantly reacting to what you learn. You fail fast, you adjust it. So everything is new and evolving all the time. And we have so many different areas. There's so much need. So we've just discussed all the different kinds of things that COLab does. We're a staff of 3 people. So the book that I gave them talked about how to structure your day so that you have 90 minutes at a time for deep thinking, and that you're not interrupted, and that you can really dig into, because every time you switch, topics, it takes, if I'm remembering right, I think it said it takes 6 minutes to kind of get to that level of depth thinking again. So that's if you only have 15 minutes, you're darn near half of your time just kind of trying to get back to depth thinking. So blocking out time for deep thinking is a really important thing. And I try to We're not perfect at it, I will say. I am many days not good at it, but I do try to do that, and I can tell the difference when we're able to do that.
Yeah. I believe the book you're referring to, Deep Thinking by Cal Newport.
That's it.
And yep. And he also has a podcast, which I highly recommend. And his latest book is Slow Productivity, which I haven't read yet, but he's talked a lot about it and very much looking into that. It's particularly an issue for this industry. And I know some people who are involved in daily deadlines wonder how they can ever even think about that. And he does address certain different industries. I don't think he's addressed journalism. I might try to get him on the podcast, but I think it's so important. And the podcast that will have just dropped before this one was with Jennifer Lorino at Lead New Orleans. And we talked a lot about slow journalism. And it's not only important for mental health, I think it actually can result in better journalism.
Yes.
And it's not easy, particularly if you're in a daily news environment, but figure out some ways to buy yourself some space. Do you have a favorite time-saving hack?
I do, and this can help you buy some space. You'll laugh at this. It's bulk cooking. It's the greatest time saving. Again, if we're talking about taking care of yourself, eating well, getting enough rest, exercising, we all know what we should be doing. And so my husband and I are into bulk cooking, where we cook a bunch and then we freeze it and then we finish work and it's time to feed everybody, and we have no groceries or whatever. No problem. We've got stuff in the freezer that we can just warm up, basically. So that saves me.
5 years out, which I know right now seems like an eternity away, but what does wild success look like for COLab and for the Colorado news ecosystem?
I think it's going to be similar, and it's going to carry the theme of what we've been talking about throughout this podcast. 5 years out, I hope that we have better systems, evolved systems of being able to coordinate services in a way that leverages the strength of each of the organizations that are trying to help. So I don't think that will even take 5 years to do. I think we're much closer to that than 5 years. But success 5 years out, COLab is helping get feet on the ground, helping overcome that fried and frozen. And then we are working with the Press Association and some of the other ecosystem players in Colorado to figure out what could we help you do, or what else could be done that would be synergistic with those things. How are we all working together so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? We've got a lot of great parts here. We need to figure out how to make the whole greater than the sum of those.
And then the final two questions, recommendations. So if someone is visiting Denver or your suburbs, what would you recommend? 3 to 5 places or activities?
Oh, fun. Okay. Places for visitors. I love Rocky Mountain National Park, and I really love the alluvial fan. I don't know if you've seen it yet. Oh, you got to go. A dam broke in the 1980s up on a mountain, and these boulders came down with the water, and now it makes this beautiful, there's water and a river basically coming down the mountain. Is all one big waterfall, and the sound of rushing water I find so soothing and relaxing, and I love that as a place. There's and it's poignant, I think, for our conversation, Tim, because there is beauty in destruction. So this industry has experienced multiple waves of destruction, and yet there is beauty in destruction. And the Park Service just made this place, Alluvial Fan, accessible to anyone. So you could be using a wheelchair and get to the fan. So it's a great place. Another place is someplace that we have been talking about multiple times in this podcast, and that's the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And I'll tell you that I love it, not just for the collaboration that COLab and the museum have done together, but it's also the place that my husband and I met first met, and it's also the place that we got engaged. So it has a very warm spot in my heart, and I recommend it to anybody who's coming to visit. I always like to take people there. And then a third spot, I don't know if you've tried this yet or not, but Strawberry Park Hot Springs. It's up near Steamboat, and it's a wonderful hot springs. It's great during the day, but the really fabulous part is at night because they don't have overhead lighting at all. So you can see the stars, you can see the Milky Way as you're soaking in the hot tub. And it is so relaxing. It's fabulous. So I commend that to anybody who might like hot springs.
Great. Do you have a favorite hole-in-the-wall restaurant or something uniquely Coloradan or Denver?
Oh, restaurants are hard for me to pick because I love so many of them. But the ones that I'm thinking that are coming to mind are Hole in the Wall, Big Bill's Pizza, love the pizza, New York style. Both my kids work, well, one kid, the other one just went a lot. And so it's a great place. It's just one of those family friendly, you go and hang out. And so I like that a lot. That's a good hole in the wall place. And Big Bill is really big, as his name suggests. And so he's funny. He drives a little smart car with Big Bill's Pizza on it. And you see him around the neighborhood.
And final question, media recommendations. So 3 to 5 pieces of media, any type, and whether it's nonfiction or just for pure enjoyment.
Again, probably the things that are coming first to the top of my mind are the things that I've read most recently. We already mentioned Reviving Rural News by Pat Ferrucci and the team. That it's, again, even if you don't think you care about rural news, it has lessons for you, for all news. Anybody who cares about the health of our news sources in this country, that's a great read and well written, and I really enjoyed that. And then, again, relevant to our conversation, Benjamin Toff wrote Avoiding the News, and that is also a really important set of lessons for us as we're talking about how do we change the narrative for local news in our country. And then the third one I would just say is my local news source. And if people don't know what their local news source is, I think I mentioned you can go to COLab's website and tap the top right button that says Find Your Local News. But I know you have listeners all over the country. You can go to findyournews.org. And findyournews.org is something that's presented by INN, the Institute for Nonprofit News. So I recommend people read their local news. It's not enough just to pay attention to national news. It's really important to understand what's happening locally. And that's where change really is going to happen. So findyournews.org.
Great. And who is your local news?
I've lived kind of all over, and the Centennial Citizen and the Brighton Blade and all of those local newspapers are all part of the Colorado Trust for Local News, which is a great partner in COLab. So I really enjoy keeping up with the local news through that organization because it's just an inspiring organization. So yes, thanks for letting me give them a shout out.
Well, we've gone really long, but I think we touched on so many important topics. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing in your favorite podcast player and sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they're on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. If you have guest recommendations, others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.